There is something haunting in these grooves, fossilized evidence that our ancestors did not drift carelessly through squalor but clawed, day by day, toward a fragile kind of cleanliness. Their bodies were canvases of contradictions, wrapped in sweat and stench, yet stubbornly stitched with the wisdom of plants and minerals. They masked scent to ward off sickness, yet in doing so wielded the hidden power of the earth itself, a pharmacopoeia growing at the threshold of every village. Garden, they sewed sachets into the armpits of knights' undershirts, not out of vanity, but to keep the flesh beneath steel from rotting in its own dampness. They turned their undergarments inside out to stretch a wash a few days more, a trick so common that priests thundered against it from the pulpit, even as they quietly did the same behind monastery walls. And when all else failed, when herbs and vinegar and linen proved too weak, they turned to the flame. Smoke, scented with lavender or rosemary, rose from hearths, not just to warm or cook, but to fumigate, to cleanse the air in which they prayed and slept and loved. In some villages, disputes erupted over stolen smoking herbs, petty thefts that carried far more weight than mere fragrance. For to steal another's sweet smoke was to threaten the fragile balance between breath and disease. It is easy to dismiss these small rituals as superstition, yet buried within each act is a truth, a species clawing at the limits of its understanding, grasping for cleanliness in a world that seemed built to decay them alive. And in this desperate grasp, they left us clues, traces of old remedies that, when tested by modern science, hold up far better than we might expect. It begs the question, did we forget more than we ever learned? What other lost instructions lie hidden in forgotten margins, inscribed on scraps of parchment, or folded into the corners of centuries-old account books? What truths did we bury when we traded rivers and hearth ash for chrome taps and chemical soaps? These medieval souls, clad in sweat-soaked linen and veiled in scented herbs, are not so far from us. They remind us that beneath our illusions of perfect hygiene and sterile modernity, we still carry the same fears, the same fragile need to hold back the rot that lurks at the edge of every breath, every pore, every heartbeat. Their world was filth and fragrance, superstition and proto-science, rumor and raw survival, all coiled together in a single, unbroken thread. And if you follow that thread, it will lead you deeper still, down into the chambers where they hid their greatest secrets about what the body can endure, what the mind can conjure, and what we may yet remember when we have forgotten everything else. Asterisk. And so we reach the final threshold, where the fabric of medieval life, stitched with linen threads and sprigs of rosemary, frays into something older, stranger, and far more unsettling. If the first layer was about fresh breath and scented shirts, and the second about foot clays and perfumed chambers, then what waits beneath it all is the truth they barely spoke aloud, that the war against filth was never just about the body, it was about the soul and the shadow that clings to it. Consider what lay hidden in the scent gardens of medieval castles. These were no mere flower beds, they were living apothecaries, enclosed by high stone walls, where select herbs were coaxed into bloom with an almost religious devotion. Lavender, thyme, rosemary, yes, for freshness. But there were stranger species too, plants said to keep away demons, to banish nightmares, to protect the dreamer when the night air grew thick with miasma. One inventory from a 1395 castle lists a perfume chamber, a vaulted room where undergarments were hung on lines above beds of crushed herbs and rose petals, the scent seeping into the very linen that touched noble flesh. These chambers were not idle luxuries, they were fortresses, fragile, fragrant barriers against forces they could not name but feared all the same. Bad air, corrupted breath, diseased humors, these were only the messengers. What they truly feared was what crept in with the rot, an invisible corruption of spirit that might spread from foul streets to unwashed bodies to the delicate fabric of the mind itself. So they invented rituals to bind the body and soul together in a kind of aromatic truce. Vinegar for the teeth and throat, mint for the breath, rosemary for the feet. Each step, each prayer, a piece of the same ancient spell. They sewed herb sachets into their garments, not only to mask sweat, but to guard the heart and lungs from unseen poisons. They placed pomanders around their necks and at their windows, not just to perfume the air, but to filter it, to catch the shadow in the sieve of clove and cinnamon before it could pass into their dreams. And they wrote it all down. Manuals lined in faded ink, pages that speak of scent as medicine, as talisman, as unspoken promise. One record, almost laughably mundane, describes a monk's fury at his brother for swapping his lavender sachet with sage, but the footnote beneath tells a deeper story, that the wrong scent could imbalance the humors, invite in a plague of bad thoughts, even tempt the soul toward sin in the dead of night. They feared that what festered in unwashed cloth would breed sickness of the flesh, but they feared more what might awaken in the mind once the body was weakened. When we look at their sachets, we see quaint superstition. When they looked at them, they saw the last line of defense in a world where science and sorcery, disease and demon, lay tangled in the same shadow. And there were always those who took it further, the smell inspectors who stalked London's alleys and markets, armed not with weapons, but with a nose trained to sniff out the rot. The foot inspectors at public baths, whose gaze turned feet into maps of moral fitness. The vinegar brewers, rumored in some chronicles to hide secret recipes, not just for fresh breath, but for spiritual cleansing. Vinegar so pure it was said to ward off the Black Death itself. Even the peasants, mocked for their inside-out shirts and herb-smoked fires, knew something we have mostly forgotten. Beneath the soot and sweat, they understood that filth is patient, that it finds the smallest tear in the fabric of the body, slips through, and rots what we most need to survive our belief that tomorrow can be cleaner, safer, more whole than today. Their footstones, their threshold grooves worn down by centuries, are not the marks of a backward age. They are quiet testaments to a fight as old as breath, the struggle to keep the darkness outside, the skin from feeding the darkness within. What lingers in this forgotten knowledge is a kind of accidental genius. Modern tests on those herb powders and foot clays show they worked, not perfectly, but well enough to slow the rot, to hold death back another dawn. The old linen weavers knew that flax drawn just so would wick moisture from the body better than the finest silks. The scent gardens turned out to be crude laboratories, where the same compounds that make mint refreshing also make it mildly antibacterial. The castle cooling rooms, the monastic seating charts, the vinegar dabs on pulse points, all primitive echoes of what we now call hygiene, climate control, antiseptics. But what they knew and what we are only beginning to remember is that cleanliness is not sterile. It is a living thing, part superstition, part science, part something else we have never quite named. When we burn sage to cleanse a room, when we spritz lavender oil to calm a restless mind, when we soak linens in hot water scented with mint, we are not inventing something new. We are brushing against the edge of an old, persistent truth, that the line between filth and purity is not drawn in the skin alone, but in the mind, in the spirit that refuses to let decay be the final word. Stand in an abandoned monastery, and breathe deep. The walls may still whisper it to you. Here lavender at dawn, here mint at noon, here rosemary at dusk. Here the stones by the threshold still hold the ghost of feet scrubbed clean by candlelight, the echoes of monks whose silent chants rose with the smoke of burning herbs. It is all still there, if you know how to listen. So perhaps the next time we dismiss the medieval world as ignorant, all rags and rank air, we should look closer at the linen fibers under a microscope, sift the ashes of the herb fires, run our fingers along the grooves of the footstones. We might find the ghost of a knowledge we've smothered in antiseptic wipes and bottled scents. The idea that staying clean is not a state, but a pact renewed every day, every breath, every drop of vinegar gargled before dawn. This is the quiet legacy they left us, a testament hidden in the stitching of old undershirts, the ashes of monastery braziers, the worn-down thresholds of peasant huts, a reminder that filth will always wait just outside the skin, and that our greatest, strangest human gift is the stubborn belief that a sprig of rosemary, a bowl of vinegar, a scrap of linen soaked in rosewater might hold the shadows back, if only for a little while longer. And maybe, just maybe, buried in these forgotten rituals lies a key, not just to how they lived, but to how we might learn to live again, not in sterile fear of the rot, but in respectful dance with it, balancing decay and renewal with each breath drawn through the fragrant air of a world forever half in shadow, half in bloom. From the rivers to the hearths, from the clove-pierced pomander to the vinegar-scented silk, the medieval struggle for cleanliness was more than a battle against stink. It was a quiet testament to human resilience, the fierce refusal to be swallowed by filth and pestilence. They did not have our soaps, our shampoos, our pressurized showers, but they wielded what they had with a kind of primitive genius, blending superstition with insight, necessity with accidental science. In these lost rituals, there lies a question that haunts our age of antibacterial wipes and scented detergents. When all our modern comforts crumble, will we remember how to keep the body safe with nothing but fire, water, and a handful of crushed herbs? Or will we stand helpless, stripped of ancient knowledge buried beneath the rivers and ash piles of forgotten villages? Asterisk in the deep folds of this hidden history, the story does not stop at rivers and pomanders, nor at vinegar, rinses and linen sachets. It tunnels further down into the unwashed corners of castles, the steaming alleys behind bathhouses, and the cryptic margins of parchment, where monks recorded secrets that were never meant for common eyes. For if the body was a fortress to be defended from the rot of dirt and disease, then teeth, the shining gate of that fortress, demanded an almost obsessive devotion. In an age when a single abscess could claim a life, these ancient mouths were battlegrounds. Letters from the late 1300s speak of noble women who woke in terror, choking on tooth cloves that slipped loose from the linen wraps they bound around their gums each night. These little linen strips were soaked in sage and rose water, the medieval equivalent of a whitening strip, but far more dangerous in the darkness of an unlit chamber, where the only thing that glowed was the soft embers of a dying hearth. Recent analysis of these preserved linen wraps, pulled from the secret caches of ancient households, shows traces of mint, sage, salt, minerals, all proof that they were not just stories told to make peasants marvel at the habits of the rich. These were deliberate, desperate attempts to hold decay at bay, to keep breath fresh enough to not betray one's rank at court. A mouth to foul could undo a marriage alliance faster than a whispered scandal. But it wasn't only the powerful who fought this quiet war. In small villages, people brewed vinegars laced with thyme, mint, rosemary, each herb a spear against the invisible armies that gathered on their tongues. They gargled before dawn prayers, believing the sharp sting in the throat drove out sickness and staved off the dreaded tooth drawer. The barber surgeons whose crude pliers tugged at molars like pulling stones from a field. Imagine, for a moment, the smell of these crude dental rinses, the temps of sour wine vinegar, the green bite of crushed mint, the bitter ghost of thyme lingering long after the first sip. Archaeologists have traced these recipes in the residues, left inside humble clay pots, forgotten behind waterland or walls for centuries. In some towns, entire guilds formed around vinegar production. Vinegar wasn't just for the kitchen or the table. It was an alchemical tool, a liquid charm. One town record from 1367 tells of a merchant so careless with his concoctions that his neighbors dragged him before a judge for brewing vinegar, so foul it fouled the air for half the street. The punishment, to provide herbs and spices for the public's pomanders for an entire month, a reminder that even the air one exhaled was a communal burden. And still, the struggle with scent went deeper, for the human body is not a sealed temple but a sieve pours open to the world, leaking sweat and fear. Before deodorants lined shop shelves in pastel rose, the medieval mind turned to things far stranger. They stitched linen sachets filled with dried herbs into the folds of their sleeves. Underarm armor against the reek of humanity. Rosemary, lavender, thyme, these weren't just garden plants, but guardians, standing watch at the moist crossroads where flesh and odor conspire. Pomanders, too, were more than jewelry, carried by chains at the waist or clasped to the breast. They were portable fortresses of scent. Gold and silver filigree cradled pungent treasures, clove buds, myrrh, cinnamon bark scraped from distant trees. It was not simply vanity. Beneath the layers of embroidered silk and stiff brocade lurked a real terror, miasma, the foul air that could creep into lungs and blood, birthing plague from stench. Some accounts even tell of noblemen brandishing pomanders like weapons as they passed the tanner's pits or crossed plague-ravaged quarters, pressing these spiced orbs to their noses to block the world's corruption from invading their flesh. There is a chilling genius in this old superstition, a primitive resonance with what we now know. Many of the same spices chosen for their pungency also carried natural antimicrobial properties. Clove oil numbed infected gums, cinnamon hindered bacterial growth, rosemary soothed inflamed wounds. Without knowing the names of their enemies, these people fought them all the same, hiding remedies in plain sight, stitched into robes, locked inside filigreed spheres. When the Great Plague struck, some cities resorted to bizarre measures that read like dark parables of collective desperation. London's civic rolls tell of fines for butchers, fishmongers, or tanners whose rancid trades crept too close to the city's beating heart. Those caught offending the communal nose might find themselves forced to supply herbs to the public, a ritual act of penance for stinking up the delicate balance between life and pestilence. Yet even these city laws were but one front. In the privacy of castles and monasteries, the war against human odor was far more elaborate. Some lords commissioned entire scent gardens, walled enclosures filled with fragrant blooms and pungent shrubs, each one carefully cultivated to perfume. the air around chambers and wardrobes. In the south-facing courtyards of certain manors, you might find rose petals scattered on floors, lavender branches woven into rushes, all to keep the stale bite of unwashed flesh at bay. Inventories list rooms labeled simply the perfume chamber, spaces devoted to the art of preservation, not of bodies, but of the fragile illusion that bodies could be kept pure. Clothes layered in petals, linen drawers lined with sachets, water infused with roses for washing silks so that even the sweat trapped in their threads carried a hint of summer bloom. A noblewoman's diary from 1388 speaks of her stewards, elaborate system for marking undershirts scented with different herbs, rose for rest, lavender for meetings, mint for days. She'd walk among the villagers and must seem fresh, above the mortal filth. And while these grand displays flickered behind stone walls, the peasants found humbler means. They wore their linen undergarments not as fashion, but as armor. Linen spun from flax that drank the sun's warmth and the earth's minerals, has an almost alchemical property to resist bacteria, to wick away the sweat that can rot a man from within. It was their daily salvation. While the heavy woolen tunics and dresses gathered dust and grime through seasons of toil, linen whispered against the skin, absorbing what might have festered. They washed these precious garments with wood ash, steeped them in boiling water laced with herbs that varied by season, warming spices in winter, cooling mints in summer. In the soils beneath ancient washhouses, archaeologists have unearthed residues of these herbal rituals, faint traces that speak of a knowledge passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, laborer to apprentice, a science without laboratories. Hidden under the hum of village life, there was a raw wisdom, too, in how they faced the sweat of their feet, that often overlooked frontier where filth took root first. Soldiers learned early that an army marches only as far as its souls can carry it. Medieval captains, hardened by campaigns that spanned frozen forests and marshland, inspected feet as keenly as swords. They stuffed boots with sage, mint, crushed thyme, accidental antifungals that staved off the trench rot and infections that could maim a man without blade or arrow. Wealthy merchants, those straddling the new mercantile empires, lavished silver coins not on the boots themselves but the herbs packed inside. Some household ledgers show purchases of foot clay, a dried, powdered soil blended with fragrant herbs, sprinkled into boots to absorb moisture. Modern experiments have revealed how eerily effective this humble powder was, rivaling today's commercial talcs and sprays. Even the monasteries, strict in spirit yet pragmatic in flesh, devised prayers for their feet. It may sound absurd to us, but for them, it was an act of reverence to wash and anoint the very souls that bore them from cell to cloister to chapel. Stones worn smooth by centuries of scraping off mud and filth have been found near doors, the grooves still bearing traces of thyme and rosemary oils. Beneath the tangled roots of our modern obsessions with cleanliness, luxury, and the scent of artificial flowers, there lies a buried truth few ever bother to unearth. In the shadowy corridors of medieval life, a different kind of hygiene existed, one woven from rivers, rain, wood, ash, vinegar, and an uncanny instinct for survival that defied the filth-drenched myths we cling to today. Most imagine medieval peasants as walking heaps of dirt and fleas, but when you stand at the edge of their rivers, where the fog clings to the reeds like the last whispers of a forgotten secret, you begin to sense how wrong that image really is. These peasants, wrapped in wool and linen, understood the pulse of water more intimately than most of us ever will. For them, the river wasn't just a place to fish or drink. It was their ancient flowing sanctuary. On warm days, families would slip beneath its surface, scrubbing away the sweat of toil with rough hands, their laughter and gossip drifting down the current like prayers to unseen spirits. In small villages lost to time, records whisper of how entire communities gathered at the water's edge, beating laundry against smooth stones, skin slick with silt and a quiet defiance of decay. They knew the river's secrets to wash downstream from the spot where you drew your drinking water. It was primitive knowledge, yet wise enough to keep parasites and plagues at bay. These men and women were no fools. They watched the way the water moved, the way it cleansed itself, and learned to mimic that subtle dance. But when winter hardened the world and the river turned to glass, bathing became a test of will and cunning. Some peasants cracked the ice, immersing their flesh in the biting cold, a ritual half purification, half penance. Others took to the cat bath, a damp cloth tracing the contours of face, hands, and feet, those parts visible to neighbors and God. There are stories, buried in brittle parish ledgers, of men who trudged home from the riverbank with frozen clothes, stiff as statues, Cautionary tales for those who mistook vanity for virtue. Beyond the rivers, rain was a gift to the sky's own baptism. When storms rolled in, villagers would strip down to their underclothes and let the downpour wash the sweat from their skin. They'd collect the water in barrels, carefully, rationing it for moments when the earth yielded nothing but dry dust. Some priests called these rain dances pagan echoes, relics of an older worship, but in truth, it was simply survival draped in the poetry of necessity. More remarkable still was what these forgotten souls did when water ran scarce. They turned to the hearth. The fire that warmed them also purified them. Ash, left behind in the fireplace, became their secret soap. They understood without chemistry, degrees that wood ash, rich in potassium carbonate, could lift the oils from skin and cloth alike. Mixed with water, it foamed into a crude lye, harsh but effective. In the hush of dawn, old women went door to door, gathering the cleanest ash, trading it like currency for bread or a scrap of cheese. There was a strange beauty to this barter, a society where waste was never truly wasted, where each pile of grey powder held the promise of a cleaner body, a less pestilent home. And in the corners of dim cottages you'd find small pouches of sand or crushed eggshells, ready to scrape away grime like the first primitive exfoliants. When all else failed, a handful of clay would do. Dry rub the dirt from your skin, brush it away, and walk out into the world with the faint scent of smoke and earth. Yet even these humble methods paled in comparison to the quiet sophistication buried in the herbs they prized. Thyme, sage, mint, these weren't mere seasonings for a pot of stew. They were potent weapons against the rot that lurked in wounds and on skin. Soldiers returning from distant skirmishes cleaned their gashes with ash infused with crushed herbs, an accidental antiseptic that saved more than a few limbs from the surgeon's saw. In the flickering light of monasteries, records reveal the existence of ash wardens, elderly widows, who built their livelihoods from the collection and sale of the purest fire remains. Sometimes, these wardens grew so respected that local lords granted them small protections, an unspoken recognition that without their filthy trade, entire villages might rot from within. And what of the times when neither river nor rain nor hearth could cleanse away the stench of human life? Here vinegar reigned supreme, gargled with mint, thyme, or sage. It freshened breath and tightened the gums. Vinegar in the morning keeps the tooth drawer away, they'd say, knowing that behind the crude humor was a desperate attempt to keep rotting teeth from the black maw of infection. Archaeologists still find medieval vinegar pots lined with traces of these herbs, silent testament to the daily rituals of mouths long turned to dust. There were even artisans who brewed nothing but scented vinegars, brewers whose recipes were so coveted they were guarded like family heirlooms. From the smallest peasant dwelling to the stone chambers of the wealthy, vinegar was splashed on wrists and throats, the sharp sting believed to close the pores and seal the body against the bad humors that drifted through the world like invisible ghosts. For the noble and merchant classes, the routines grew ever more elaborate. Letters from the late 14th century speak of women wrapping their teeth in cloth soaked with sage and rosewater, sleeping through the night with linen pressed tight around their gums in hopes of waking with a whiter smile. There are glimpses, too, of mishaps, a noblewoman nearly choking on her precious toothcloves as she slept, her beauty routine turning traitor in the darkness. The same obsession extended to the air they breathed. In a world that reeked of tanners' pits and unwashed bodies, the threat of bad air, miasma, felt as real as any visible enemy, so they fashioned pomanders, hollow orbs of precious metal packed with pungent herbs and exotic spices, clove, cinnamon, nutmeg, each sent a talisman against the sickness they believed rode on the wings of stench. Some pomanders grew so large they swung like pendulums from a lady's belt, knocking into passers-by with every fragrant step. Court records speak of pigs gobbling up dropped pomanders, their gilded shells lost to the mud, their carefully hoarded spices churned into filth by snouts and hooves. Yet behind this obsession with masking odor lay an accidental brilliance. Many of the herbs stuffed into these golden orbs possessed real antimicrobial powers. Clove oil to numb a toothache, cinnamon to ward off infection, rosemary to calm a wound. Medieval people might not have known the word bacteria, but they read the signs well enough. In this fragile alliance between guesswork and survival, they built a kind of folk science that modern researchers are only now beginning to respect. Within the walls of towns, odor itself became regulated. London's bylaws from 1371 threatened leather tanners with steep fines if they dared practice too close to the city's beating heart. The punishment, providing the public with aromatic herbs to stuff into their shared pomanders as if one foul trade could be redeemed by another. And so the city breathed through cloves and rosemary, a medieval compromise between stench and salvation. In grand estates and cramped hovels alike, herbs were everywhere, tucked in linen closets, sewn into undergarments, smoldering in hearths. They were a defense against the nose, but also a balm for the spirit. A monastery smell schedule, hidden away for centuries, reveals how monks synchronized their daily prayers with changing scents, invigorating mint at dawn, lavender at dusk, a sensory liturgy that bridged the body and soul. Yet all these efforts meant little if the feet, the very foundation of survival, were left to fester. For peasants who spent half their lives barefoot, the earth itself was both cleanser and threat. Village scribes wrote of men with souls, as tough as leather feet that carried them across fields and frost, cracked but oddly resilient. Beneath the arches of noble halls, things took a different turn. Silk stockings soaked in vinegar, herbal powders sprinkled into shoes, servants known as pesters tending to toes with near-religious devotion, all in service of feet too pampered to touch the soil. In the clash of classes and climates, one truth remains: whether barefoot in a field or slippered in silk, every medieval soul understood that filth was not just dirt, it was decay, disease, the slow creep of death itself. And so they scrubbed with ash and sand, they chewed mint, twigs to clean their teeth, they wore linen against their skin, layer upon layer absorbing sweat and fear alike. They built hidden corners in homes for scraping mud from souls. They filed their nails with shards of bone, rubbed mustard seed into scalps to quell the itch of lice, and laid their heads to sleep on sacks filled with lavender and thyme. These were not superstitions alone, they were the last defenses of bodies, pressed hard against a world eager to reclaim them. Somewhere deep in a monastery's archive, a map of the foot connects each toe to an organ, a medieval echo of reflexology that still pulses through wellness shops today. Stones worn smooth by centuries of feet stand like fossils of a time when the line between dirt and health was a daily negotiation. Never won, but never fully lost. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment below. See you in the next one.